The Interspecies Exploration Coalition had been charting unexplored worlds for 3 centuries, armed with enough technology to make ancient civilizations weep and enough bureaucracy to make modern ones feel right at home. Their latest expedition had landed on Verdansk 7, a lush jungle planet that supposedly experienced mild seasonal variations according to the initial probe data. The key word here being supposedly, because probe data had the same reliability as weather forecasts, technically accurate until reality decided to have other plans. The expedition team had set up their base camp in a clearing that the Zeltharian cartographer Krikstal had declared optimally positioned for maximum operational efficiency, which translated from bureaucratic nonsense into plain speech meant flat ground near water. Revolutionary thinking, truly. The camp consisted of 8 prefabricated habitat modules, a central communications hub, various scientific equipment that blinked importantly, and enough supplies to last 6 months. Everything was state-of-the-art, naturally, because the coalition didn't do anything halfway except their threat assessments, apparently. Among the 12-member expedition team stood one human, Marcus Webb, listed officially as structural engineer and systems technician. He was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-30s with perpetually messy brown hair and the kind of practical demeanor that came from actually fixing things instead of just talking about fixing things. The rest of the crew consisted of various species from across coalition space, each convinced that their particular evolutionary path had granted them superior wisdom about jungle survival. There was Krikstal, the Zeltharian cartographer, whose species had evolved on a desert world and thought moisture was a theoretical concept. His exoskeleton gleamed an iridescent blue, and he moved with the jerky precision of someone whose ancestors had never needed to worry about slipping on wet surfaces. Then there was Vaughn, a Kralik xenobiologist built like a bipedal bear made of muscle and overconfidence. His thick fur was supposedly adaptive to multiple climates, though Marcus suspected it was really just adaptive to being uncomfortable everywhere. The expedition leader was Commander Thelnora, a Vindrani whose species prided themselves on logic and planning. She stood nearly 7 feet tall, with silvery skin and those unsettling triple-jointed arms that could type reports while simultaneously gesturing dismissively at concerns. Her career had been built on successful missions to 17 different worlds, none of which had apparently taught her that nature didn't care about success statistics. Rounding out the key members was Pip, a Quellan communications officer who looked like someone had given a ferret opposable thumbs and delusions of technical grandeur. The Quellans were small, furry, and absolutely convinced that any problem could be solved with the right frequency modulation. Spoiler alert, Floodwater doesn't care about your signal strength. The first 3 weeks on Verdansk 7 had gone smoothly, which should have been everyone's first warning sign. The team collected samples, catalogued flora and fauna, and sent back glowing reports about the planet's potential for colonization. The jungle was rich with life, the water sources were clean, and the weather had been pleasantly warm with occasional rain showers. Paradise, basically, if you ignored the fact that paradise had a nasty habit of trying to kill you. Marcus had started noticing the changes on day 22. The morning air felt different, heavier, like the atmosphere was holding its breath. The usually cacophonous jungle had gone quiet, with even the howler analogues, local creatures that sounded like malfunctioning air horns, falling silent. The river that ran 50 meters from their camp had risen noticeably overnight, its normally lazy flow now moving with purpose. "Commander," Marcus had said during the morning briefing, "I think we should relocate to higher ground." The lonerer had looked up from her datapad with the expression of someone being told that gravity might be optional. Based on what data, Engineer Webb? Based on the river rising 8 inches overnight, the atmospheric pressure dropping, and every animal with functional survival instincts heading for the hills. Marcus gestured toward the jungle canopy. Also, those clouds building to the east looked like they're auditioning for an apocalypse. Kristal had clicked his mandibles in what passed for Zeltharian laughter. The probe data indicates this region experiences only moderate precipitation during this season. Your concern is noted but statistically improbable. Right, Marcus had said slowly. Because probe data has never been wrong before. The Coalition probes have a 94% accuracy rating. The lonerer had replied, which meant she'd completely missed his sarcasm. We will continue monitoring conditions, but relocating the entire camp based on preliminary observations would be inefficient. Vaughn had grunted his agreement, his species apparently confusing stubbornness with wisdom. My people have weathered storms on 6 different worlds. A little rain won't harm us. Marcus had looked at Pip, who at least had the decency to look uncertain. The Quellan had been monitoring weather patterns and had surely seen the same concerning data. But Pip had just shrugged, his whiskers twitching nervously, unwilling to contradict the command structure over something as trivial as potential catastrophic flooding. So Marcus had done what humans did when everyone else was being collectively stupid. He'd started preparing anyway. He'd moved his personal gear to waterproof containers, secured backup power supplies in elevated locations, and most importantly, he'd started eyeing the massive trees that surrounded their clearing. Some of those trees had to be at least 200 feet tall, with trunks wide enough to hollow out and rent as studio apartments. The storm had arrived on day 24, with all the subtlety of a freight train driven by an angry deity. The sky had opened up like someone had torn a hole in the universe's water tank, and the rain came down in sheets so thick that visibility dropped to about 3 feet. Within an hour, the river had jumped its banks. Within 2 hours, water was flowing through the camp. This is highly irregular. Kristal had shouted over the roar of the deluge, as if the weather might apologize and correct itself if properly admonished. Everyone to the habitat modules, Commander the Lenora had ordered, demonstrating that leadership instinct that said the best response to rising water was to hide in ground-level buildings. Marcus had stood in the rapidly flooding camp, rain plastering his hair to his skull, watching the water rise from ankle-deep to knee-deep in about 15 minutes. The habitat modules were sealed units, sure, but they were also sitting directly on the ground, and several were already beginning to tilt as the soil beneath them turned to soup. Vaughn had been trying to secure equipment that was already half submerged, his thick fur now weighing him down like a soggy carpet. Pip had been frantically attempting to save the communications array, his small frame struggling against the wind. The rest of the crew had been in various states of panic, scrambling to save supplies and equipment, while the jungle very pointedly demonstrated who was actually in charge here. "Forget the modules," Marcus had bellowed, his voice barely carrying over the storm. "We need to get up." "Up where?" the Lenora had demanded, water now swirling around her midsection. Marcus had pointed toward the massive trees at the clearing's edge. "Up there." The look she'd given him suggested he'd just proposed they all sprout wings and fly to safety. "You're suggesting we climb trees. We're not arboreal primitives, Engineer Webb. No, you're about to be drowned bureaucrats if you don't move." Marcus had already been wading toward the nearest giant, a massive specimen with branches the size of normal trees starting about 30 feet up. "We're building up." "Building what?" Kristal had clicked nervously, his exoskeleton making him sink faster than the others. "A treehouse," Marcus had shouted back, like it was the most obvious thing in the world, because honestly it was. The word treehouse had clearly not been in any of their extensive coalition training. The aliens had looked at each other with the universal expression of species questioning whether the human had finally cracked under pressure. But the water was now chest deep and still rising. The habitat modules were beginning to float and collide with each other, and sometimes survival meant trusting the crazy ape, who seemed weirdly calm about impending doom. Marcus had reached the tree and immediately started assessing it with an engineer's eye. The bark was rough, providing decent grip. The lowest branches were thick enough to support considerable weight. The tree itself was clearly ancient and stable, having survived whatever seasonal nonsense this planet threw at it. Perfect, Marcus had called. I need the emergency cables from Module 3. Module 3 is underwater. The Quellan had squeaked. Then dive for them. Everyone else, start gathering anything that floats, supply crates, furniture panels, whatever. Marcus had pulled out his multi-tool and started cutting handholds into the bark. Vaughn, you're the strongest. Start hauling stuff over here once Pip gets those cables. There was something about a human giving orders during a crisis that made other species temporarily forget their cultural superiority. Maybe it was the confidence. Maybe it was the fact that Marcus was already 15 feet up the tree and making it look easy. Or maybe it was the water now reaching neck level on most of them. Whatever the reason, they started moving. Pip had disappeared beneath the murky water and resurfaced moments later with a coil of emergency cable, the kind rated to tow spacecraft. Vaughn had grabbed floating equipment containers, his massive strength finally useful for something besides opening stubborn jar lids. The lonerer had organized the others into a supply chain, her triple arms actually proving advantageous for once. Marcus had reached the first major branch and immediately started working. He secured the cable around the trunk, then began lowering it to haul up supplies. The branch was roughly 40 feet above the original ground level, which meant it was now about 30 feet above the water, and the water was still rising. This is insane, Crickstal had shouted as Vaughn had literally thrown him up to the branch, where Marcus caught the flailing Zeltharian. Insane is staying on the ground. Marcus had shouted back, already lashing together supply crates to form a platform base. Start helping or start swimming. The next 2 hours had been a blur of frantic construction. Marcus had worked with the focused intensity of someone who'd spent way too much of his childhood building forts and way too much of his adulthood understanding structural engineering. The emergency cables became support lines, floating equipment containers became platform sections, waterproof tarps became walls and roofing. The aliens had helped with varying degrees of usefulness. The lonerer's multiple arms made her excellent at holding things in place. Vaughn's strength meant he could haul up materials that would have taken 3 others. Pip's small size let him wiggle into tight spaces to secure connections. Crickstal mostly complained but occasionally made himself useful by calculating weight distributions, probably to prove his near drowning had been a statistically sound decision. By the time they'd gotten everyone and the essential supplies up to the first platform, the water had risen to about 20 feet above ground level. The habitat modules were completely submerged, visible only as dark shapes beneath the murky surface. The communications array was gone. Most of their scientific equipment was gone. Their carefully planned expedition had turned into an impromptu swimming pool, and they were now living in a tree like oversized birds with engineering degrees. We need more space, Marcus had said, surveying their cramped platform. 12 team members crammed onto a 10 by 10 platform made for intimate bonding experiences nobody wanted. More space, The Lenora had looked at him like he'd suggested redecorating during a house fire. "We're in a tree, Engineer Webb." "Yeah, and that tree has more branches." Marcus had pointed upward, where another massive limb extended about 15 feet above them. "We're building a second story." The protests had been immediate and numerous. They were exhausted. They were soaked. They were traumatized by having their technological superiority drowned by planetary hydrology. Building one tree platform had been desperate survival. Building a second was just showing off. But Marcus had already been studying the upper branch, planning load-bearing points and support structures in his head. "The water's still rising," he'd pointed out calmly. "We build up, or we're back to swimming. Your choice." Nobody had liked it, but nobody had disagreed either. So up they'd gone. The second level had been more ambitious. With the immediate panic subsiding into general misery, Marcus had time to actually design something functional instead of just frantically lashing materials together. He'd used the thicker cables to create a frame suspended between multiple branches, distributing weight properly. The platform had gone from 10 by 10 to something closer to 15 by 15, with a separate sleeping area elevated slightly above the main level. Vaughn had proven surprisingly adept at knotwork, his thick fingers managing complex lashing patterns. The Lenora had coordinated supply management, rationing their remaining equipment and food. Pip had somehow rigged a water collection system using tarps and containers, because apparently Quellens were useful when they couldn't rely on technology. Crickstal had continued to calculate and complain in equal measure, though his precise measurements had actually helped Marcus ensure the structure wouldn't collapse and kill them all. Engineers appreciated accuracy, even when it came wrapped in mandible-clicking anxiety. By day 3 of the flood, they'd completed what could only be described as a legitimate 2-story treehouse. The lower level served as their main living area, with secured supply containers forming walls and the waterproof tarps creating a roof that actually kept out most of the rain. The upper level was smaller but elevated enough to stay dry even during the worst downpours, functioning as both sleeping quarters and an observation deck. Marcus had even managed to create a basic pulley system for moving supplies between levels, because if you were going to live in a tree, you might as well do it efficiently. The whole structure swayed slightly when the wind picked up, which terrified the aliens and made Marcus oddly nostalgic for backyard construction projects. Life in the treehouse had settled into a rhythm that was equal parts survival and sitcom. 12 beings from different species, crammed into close quarters, with nothing to do but wait for the water to recede and contemplate their life choices. Mealtimes were particularly entertaining. The expedition rations had been designed for efficiency, not palatability, and eating them while sitting on a tree branch really highlighted their shortcomings. Vaughn ate his in silence, his species apparently lacking taste buds and therefore lacking opinions. Crickstal complained about the texture interfering with his mandible movements. Pip ate like a tiny furry vacuum cleaner, inhaling rations in seconds. The sleeping arrangements were even better. 12 team members trying to sleep on an elevated platform meant someone was always accidentally kicking someone else. Vaughn snored like a malfunctioning engine. Pip made small chirping sounds in his sleep. Crickstal's exoskeleton clicked whenever he shifted position, creating a rhythm that made everyone want to throw him into the water below. "I've served on 17 expeditions," Thelenora had said one evening, staring out at the flooded jungle, "and this is by far the most undignified." "Could be worse," Marcus had replied, working on reinforcing a support cable. "We could still be underwater. We're living in a tree, Engineer Webb, built by hand. Like primitives, like survivors," Marcus had corrected. "Big difference." The water had reached its peak on day 5, lapping at the underside of their first-level platform. Marcus's height estimate had been nearly perfect, another 3 feet, and they would have needed a third story. The storm had finally broken on day 6, the endless rain reducing to intermittent showers. By day 7, the water had visibly begun receding. They'd watched it go down inch by inch, revealing the devastation below. The habitat modules had shifted and collided, creating a jumbled wreckage. Equipment and supplies floated everywhere, most of it damaged beyond repair. The communications array was twisted metal and broken components. Their carefully organized camp had become an aquatic junkyard. 3 months of setup, the Nora had said quietly. Gone in 3 days. Hey, at least we're alive, Marcus had pointed out. That's a win in my book. Crystal had clicked thoughtfully. The human is correct. Survival supersedes equipment loss. Did you just agree with me? Marcus had asked, genuinely surprised. Do not make a habit of it, the Zelthurian had replied, but there'd been something almost respectful in his tone. By day 10, the water had receded enough to reveal muddy ground. The team had climbed down from their treehouse carefully because nobody wanted to survive a flood just to die from a stupid fall, and assessed the damage. It was catastrophic from an equipment standpoint, but manageable from a survival perspective. They had enough supplies, the backup emergency beacon had survived, and coalition rescue protocols meant a ship would come looking when they missed their scheduled check-in. The real work had begun then, salvage operations, establishing a new ground camp, and documenting everything for the inevitable reports and inquiries. The coalition would want to know how an entire expedition had nearly been wiped out by moderate precipitation. Engineer Webb, the Nora had called one afternoon, about 2 weeks after the flood. She'd been reviewing the incident reports, her expression thoughtful. Your quick thinking and construction skills saved this expedition. I'm recommending you for a commendation. Marcus had been sorting through waterlogged equipment, trying to determine what could be salvaged. Appreciated, Commander, but I just did what needed doing. By building a 2-story treehouse in the middle of a catastrophic flood, Vaughan had added, having gained a new appreciation for practical engineering, using primitive techniques that somehow outperformed our advanced technology. About that, Pip had interjected, his whiskers twitching with curiosity. How did you know? How did you know exactly what to do? Marcus had shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. When I was a kid, maybe 8 or 9, I spent an entire summer building a treehouse in my backyard. 3 stories, actually, with a rope bridge to another tree. My parents thought I was crazy, spending all that time on something impractical. He'd smiled at the memory. Guess it wasn't so impractical after all. The silence that had followed was profound. A dozen alien beings, representing some of the most advanced species in coalition space, processing the fact that their survival had depended on a human's childhood hobby. You're telling me, Crystal had said slowly, that the skill set that saved 12 lives and an entire expedition was learned recreationally. As a juvenile, pretty much, yeah. The Lenora had made a note on her datapad. I'm adding a new requirement to expedition protocols. All teams must include at least one member with practical construction experience, particularly human members with impractical childhood hobbies. I'm also noting, she'd continued, her tone dry, that we should perhaps place more weight on environmental observations and less weight on probe data accuracy ratings. 94%, Marcus had said helpfully. Don't forget the 94%. Vaughan had laughed, a deep rumbling sound. The human has earned sarcasm privileges. The rescue ship had arrived 3 weeks after the flood, their crew finding the expedition team alive, functional, and living in a remarkably well-constructed treehouse that had become something of a permanent fixture. The rescue commander had stood at the base of the tree, looking up at the 2-story structure, then at the devastated camp, then back at the structure. "So," the rescue commander had said, "when the flood came, you built. This is Marcus," the Lenora had replied, gesturing to the human. "Marcus built this. We mostly just tried not to drown," and questioned his sanity. "I'm writing a paper," Crystal had announced, "on the statistical improbability of primitive survival techniques outperforming advanced technological solutions. I expect it will cause considerable controversy in academic circles. I'm just glad I don't have to sleep next to Vaughan snoring anymore." Pip had muttered. The treehouse had been left behind when they'd evacuated, too integrated into the tree to safely dismantle, and not worth the effort anyway. But the rescue team had documented it extensively, taken measurements, and filed it in the expedition records. Somewhere in Coalition archives, there now existed detailed specifications for a 2-story emergency treehouse, built by hand, that had outperformed millions of credits worth of advanced technology. As the rescue ship had lifted off, Marcus had taken one last look at Verdansk 7 and his creation standing proud among the jungle canopy. Somewhere down there, his childhood treehouse skills had become a legitimate survival technique. His parents would have found that hilarious. "Engineer Webb," the Lenora had said, settling into her seat, "your next assignment will be interesting. We're assembling a team for an ocean world with unpredictable tide patterns." Marcus had raised an eyebrow. "Planning to drown me properly this time, Commander?" "Planning to have someone who knows how to build boats from scratch," she'd replied, the faintest hint of a smile crossing her features. "I assume that was also a childhood hobby." "Actually, yeah. Built a raft when I was 12. The groans from the other expedition members had been universal and deeply satisfying. The Interspecies Exploration Coalition continued charting unexplored worlds, armed with enough technology to make ancient civilizations weep, and now, apparently, enough practical sense to include humans who'd had interesting childhoods. The probe data for Verdansk 7 was updated to note catastrophic seasonal flooding instead of moderate precipitation, and someone, somewhere, probably got a stern memo about accuracy ratings. And in a jungle on a distant world, a 2-story treehouse stood as a monument to the fact that sometimes the most advanced solution was knowing how to tie a really good knot, and having spent way too much time playing in trees as a kid. The galaxy was vast, full of wonders and dangers and species that thought technology solved everything. But occasionally, just occasionally, what you really needed was a human who remembered that going up was always an option, and that the best emergency shelter was one you built yourself, even if everyone else thought you were absolutely insane for trying. The universe, as it turned out, had a sense of humor. It just usually expressed it through catastrophic flooding and forcing advanced civilizations to live in trees.